Dynamically, it can identify the properties. Attributes are HTML level. Properties are dynamic. So your elements, JavaScript, jQuery, if they have to dynamically deal with your elements, they use properties on. So you can bind any value to a property by using property binding technique. So square brace by using property binding technique. So syntax, generally how we can define that, by how you can define that. So public and username is equal to some John, like this, and I need to bind. How we can bind to any element? For example, if I have to bind input type is equal to text, value is a property which is written in this way. Value is written in this way, and here we have to use just username. We have to use that username. You don't need any interpolation. The properties are defined in square brace, and we can bind to the properties. Now, important, these properties are not JavaScript properties. These are Angular properties. That means generally Angular can recognize these properties and bind a value to that. Now, for example, if I have to display name inside data definition. Data definition is an HTML element. DD is an HTML element. Data definition it is. So it is an element. To this element, I need to bind the value. Generally, currently name is empty. I need to bind the value. How you will bind the value? Here, how we can bind to data definition? Data definition, it doesn't have any value property. Then how you will bind to it? Actually, if it is data definition, if it is a paragraph or heading, they have a property. The property is nothing but you can use a property called inner HTML or inner text. I hope many of you know that. And you know the difference also. Inner HTML, inner text, what is difference? Inner text will allow formats. Inner HTML will not allow, inner HTML will allow formats. Inner text will not allow formats. Right? HTML, I can bind the value. What is it? Product dot, here I can define as price. Product dot name, it is binding. Then you can see that the product name is binded to the property, then it can display the value. So you can directly use a binding expression to interpolation technique, or you can define the properties and you can bind to the properties. Now, which one is better? Generally, if you are using an approach where you have to just bind a value, no need of evaluating any expression. then you can better go with this property binding technique. In these scenarios, means where you have to evaluate an expression. For example, product quantity into product price, then it is recommended to use expressions. Why? Because, for example, here we are defining inner HTML again, and here we are writing the expression. So here we are writing expression product dot quantity into, so product dot price. We are defining the expression. Now important, this is also having the ability, actually you can see that is also having the ability. So that is also having the ability. But if it is a lengthy expression and it needs to do lot of formats in that expression, it is difficult to handle because you have to use lot of parentheses again, because you have to use a lot of parentheses to handle like an expression. It is difficult to handle expressions, especially while you are using a property binding technique. That's the reason generally we use an interpolation technique for expression. This also evaluates. Property binding also allows you to bind an expression. It also allows you to bind an expression. But generally, interpolation is the best way of evaluating an expression and binding an expression. All right. So, but property binding, so when you are dealing with expressions, so in property binding expressions, you need a lot of implementation for dealing with expressions actually. Declaring values, evaluating the values, returning the values, and storing the values in the references. So for that, better we can go with interpolation techniques. So you can do in this way also. This is the property binding technique. This is the property binding technique. That means, so what we have to do, an example, everything same as previous. Just we can use like this. Now inner HTML is a property. So you can bind to that property. Value is a property. You can bind to that particular property, right? Interpolation and value you can bind and you can configure that. Now important here is when you are dealing with property binding, one of the major problem is, so here note is every property, so doesn't have, or you can simply say that every HTML attribute doesn't have a relative attribute. That is one problem. Doesn't have a relative attribute. That means it doesn't have relative attribute. Suppose we have table have an option attribute call span, and important is table call span is not available as a property, that means all are not available as properties. That is one of the major issue. All are not available as properties. All are not available as properties. Now, in that case, then what we have to do is we have to bind to the attribute only. So that means every time we cannot bind to the property. So for example, generally